As I've gotten older, I've started to subscribe to the belief that I don't hate any genre or type of media. If I don't like a genre, it just means that I haven't yet found the example that will show me the things I like about it. I haven't been a fan of country music, for example, but over time I've listened to some songs that are considered classics and expanded my horizons, and so it's no longer accurate to say that I hate country music. I hate twangy, patriotism-fueled songs about pickup trucks, but I don't hate the entire genre. As a kid, I used to hate the idea of realistic racing games. Why would you play a video game where you drive a regular car when you could instead play a game where you race on hoverboards or fantasy go-karts in fictional settings? And so, for a while, Mario Kart, Sonic Riders, and the occasional stray Cruisin' Exotica cabinet were the only racing games I thought were worth my time. As I entered middle and high school, I might occasionally play Forza with my family, but it was never something I thought was worth learning to play seriously. It was strictly a multiplayer time killer and nothing more. Racing games were a genre I didn't put much stock into until... Sometimes, the thing that teaches you to love a genre is finding the purest distillation of it. And one afternoon a few years ago, I found the game that would forever change how I play racing games. Daytona USA released in 1994 as an arcade cabinet. It had a few old PC and Sega Saturn ports that were a bit before my time, and a 2011 re-release on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The 2011 re-release is what I ended up getting around 2020 or 2021. It's a little hard to remember exactly when. I'd previously heard of Daytona through a few YouTube videos by other eccentric Sega fans, but I'd never been curious enough to pick it up and play it. There probably was a Daytona arcade cabinet or two at various family fun centers when I was a child, but my aforementioned aversion to racing games didn't allow the series to make an impression on me. No, it was well into my adulthood, sitting alone in my apartment with a recently obtained Xbox Series X, when I finally played the little racing game that managed to burrow deep into the folds of my brain. The process to even obtain the game was pretty tedious. Daytona had been softy listed for quite some time now, technically playable on modern Xboxes, but not available for purchase on modern Xbox storefronts. I had to log into the Xbox 360 marketplace from my computer to essentially backport my Microsoft account and finally spend $10 on the game, and I did it just in time too, since the Xbox 360 marketplace no longer allows you to purchase any games at all. You might still be able to do this on the PlayStation 3, but I haven't been able to find the game listed on the PlayStation website. The funny part is, I don't even know what compelled me to try the game, because, again, I kinda hated the idea of racing games. Perhaps it was the combination of finally learning to love knights and playing Panzer Dragoon Orta for the first time that made me willing to take the risk on this arcade racing game. Because surely, classic Sega could do me no wrong. Daytona's 2011 port greeted me with AM2's charming polygonal visuals and a bright, upbeat soundtrack that really can't be beat. Of course, I chose automatic transmission because not liking racing games also meant not knowing how to manage manual transmission in a racing game. At first, it seemed to be exactly like what I thought all racing games were. An okay way to spend a few quarters or kill an hour or two when I want something mindless, but not something I care to learn. Partly due to not wanting to wade through the massive Game Pass library, and partly because I had to undergo a weird workaround just to have the damn thing on my console, I didn't stop there. Unlike Forza, or Cruisin', or whatever weird Namco racing game I had that was bundled with Pac-Man Vs on my GameCube, I had sought this game out. I paid for it because other people had sung its praises, so there must have been something in there to praise it for. And so, for the first time ever, I took the time to learn a more realistic racing game. The great thing about Daytona's 2011 port is that it has a mission mode that flat out teaches you how to handle different portions of the track. Because I took the time to play through the mission mode, I finally learned that I'd been playing racing games wrong the entire time. When you stick to automatic transmission in these games, every time you hit a tight turn, you can only ever hit the brakes or hit a wall. Drifting just feels like an impossibility, something there should be a button for, like in Mario Kart. The thing about more realistic racing games, though, is that you don't use a button to drift, you use a stick. Okay, technically on the console port you do hit buttons for drifting, but the buttons are there to simulate the positions on the gearbox they put in the arcade cabinet. And it doesn't work like Mario Kart drifting. If you want to drift, and I mean really drift, you have to choose manual transmission, and you have to earn that drift. Because mission mode forces you into whatever transmission the scenario calls for, I was forced to learn how to use manual transmission. I had to learn why it was important to switch gears, when to switch gears, and how downshifting on a tight turn allowed me to take a drift without losing as much speed as just hitting the brakes. And suddenly, I got it. I started to feel the momentum of the car, I learned how to throw its weight around, I found my flow state in Daytona. And most importantly, I learned that I fucking hate automatic transmission. In the span of an afternoon, I went from thinking that racing games were stupid to saying, yeah, I'd let the high-class Hornet go all the way, I know she'd treat me right. Of course, I did what any girl in my situation would do, and I sought out more of this life-changing experience. Daytona USA only has 3 tracks to its name, and that's not nearly enough to sate my hunger. Now, Daytona does have sequels, but there's just one problem. You can't fucking find them on modern devices. The original game had its share of expanded ports on PC and Sega Saturn. In the case of the Saturn, that means actually tracking down a working console and a no doubt expensive disc, since the console is notoriously difficult to emulate. For the PC ports, you can find them if you look hard enough, but you will have to contend with broken compatibility and possibly have to wrestle with a forum post or two to get it running. There's a Dreamcast game referred to as Daytona USA 2001, which doesn't get a lot of coverage, but does supposedly retain the courses from the expanded PC ports. I haven't played it yet, only recently finding a loose disc for it by chance in a used game shop, but perhaps soon I'll change that. Maybe I'll even cover it in a video. The first numbered sequel to the game, Daytona USA 2 Battle on the Edge, only released in arcades, with one exception. You can play the game on modern consoles if you visit the arcade in Like a Dragon Gaiden, although there you have to play the debranded Sega Racing Classic 2, which removes any and all NASCAR-related materials. To date, the final entry in the Daytona series is Daytona Championship USA, or Daytona 3 Championship USA, which also released exclusively in arcades in 2017. The game never had even a hint of a home port, but there may still be a way to play it outside of an arcade setting. Today, arcade cabinets are more like PCs in a box than the bespoke hardware they used to be in the 80s and 90s. A lot of modern arcade games could hypothetically be played on a home computer, perhaps with a little bit of finagling to account for peripheral differences. So, if, hypothetically, someone at Sega made a minor fuck-up on the arcade distribution website where anyone, not just the arcade vendors, could download the entire game executable for Daytona 3, well, then that executable might end up being forever accessible online if you knew where to look for it. And, hypothetically, If that game executable were out there and there were dedicated fans who spent time and effort figuring out how to get the game to accept a standard X input controller as a racing wheel, well, that would mean that secretly there's been a completely accessible PC port of Daytona 3 this whole time. I had the chance to play Daytona 3 at a local arcade a few years ago. Unfortunately, at least from what I played, the game is more or less a high-definition remake of the original Daytona USA. The original 3 tracks are playable in this game, as well as 3 mirrored versions of said tracks, with different aesthetics of course. Perhaps the reason Sega didn't make a port for this one is that, while it would probably be pretty easy to do, the game is so light in content that it couldn't retail for more than $10. And that kind of price point probably wouldn't sustain the server costs necessary to fulfill the required online multiplayer mode. Daytona USA is, sadly, an example of the absolute hell that licensing brings to game releases. You can only play a debranded port of Daytona 2 for the same reason you can't buy Afterburner Climax or play Crazy Taxi on Steam with the original soundtrack. Licensing. Daytona USA uses the branding of the Daytona International Speedway, which unfortunately means that re-releases and sequels have to deal with licensing costs and potential exclusivity deals. For re-releases, this usually translates to pay up, debrand, or don't bother. As it stands with Daytona, the cost of licensing or debranding doesn't seem to be worth it in Sega's mind unless the game is folded into an Easter egg for a larger, more popular game series. Unfortunately, this also leaves me with a bit of a Daytona-shaped hole in my life. I'm sure there are other games with similarly refined controls and a sense of momentum that I could play on my PC or a home console. Perhaps when I start having income that I can consider to be disposable again, I'll take a chance on some other racing game and see how I feel. But even knowing that opportunity is somewhere on my horizon, I don't know that other racing games will feel quite the same to me as Daytona does. Part of what I love about Daytona is its sense of style. The low poly models and the very 90s soundtrack helped to lower my walls so I could finally appreciate racing games. Even Daytona 3 doesn't really hit the same since its visuals lean more towards realism, as most of the big racing games I've seen nowadays tend to do. Maybe when I have the chance to pick up the current Forza Motorsport, those worries will melt away as I slip back into my flow state, and I won't feel a severe lack of 90s house music, but at least right now, I'm still a little hung up on her. So, what conclusions can even be drawn from all of my rambling mess? Well, firstly, go and find a way to play Daytona. That is perhaps easier said than done at the moment, considering the myriad of licensing restrictions, but I know you'll find a way. Secondly, the 2011 re-release of Daytona really drives home why having tutorials and room to experiment is useful in game design. If I didn't have the mission mode teaching me how to handle the aspects of each track, I probably wouldn't have learned to appreciate the intricacies of racing simulation controls. And finally, sometimes the thing you need to appreciate a genre is just to take an afternoon and sit down with it to explore its depth. You're not gonna like every game in a genre, but that's also true of the genres you already like. I'm not a huge fan of military first-person shooters like Call of Duty, but something a little more science fiction and story-driven like BioShock and Time Splitters does allow me to engage with and appreciate the first-person shooter genre. And as someone who loves platformers, I can say pretty confidently that not every platformer I've played has been a hit. Okay, there is one more conclusion to draw here, but it's less for you and me and more for some specific executives. If you have any kind of decision-making power at Sega and you've somehow stumbled across this video, please bring back Daytona. Now, when I say this, I don't mean put the ROM in a virtual arcade inside a Yakuza game. I want a real, actual Daytona game, whether that be a collection, a souped-up re-release, or a new entry. I know licensing can be a pain, and in the interest of making sure the game doesn't disappear in a few years, maybe you can abandon the Daytona brand. Debranded re-releases of Daytona have happened before under the Sega Racing Classic brand. And when you do this, if you do this, send me a review code. Of course, I want to keep my channel honest here and give an unbiased opinion on any game I cover. But if you put out another racing game that manages to hit the same high points as previous Daytona games, I'll probably be singing its praises whether you call it Daytona or not. With all of that said, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll watch again in the next video. And please, Sega, if you're greenlighting the next Daytona game, I need you to remember that the house music is an essential component to the game. I want to fly sky high, so let's all go together.